You deleted their number. You blocked them on everything. You sat across from your best friend and said the words out loud, "I'm done. I know they were bad for me." And you meant it, every single syllable of it. And then, 3 weeks later, at 2 in the morning, in the quiet of a room that suddenly feels too large, something happens inside your chest. Not a thought exactly, something older than thought, something that moves through you like weather. You miss them, not the fights, not the silence that lasted for days, not the way they made you feel small or confused or like you were always one wrong word away from losing everything. You don't miss that. You'd never choose that again. And yet, there it is, sitting in your ribcage like an uninvited guest who somehow still knows the layout of your home. And here is where most people do something deeply human. They turn inward with judgment. They ask themselves, what is wrong with me? Why can't I just move on? I know they were toxic. I know I'm better off. So why does my brain keep going back? If that's you right now, I need you to hear this before anything else. There is nothing wrong with you. What you are experiencing is not weakness. It is not stupidity. It is not some romantic delusion about a person who didn't deserve you. What you are experiencing is one of the most sophisticated and most misunderstood processes in all of human neuroscience. Your brain is not missing them because it loved them. Your brain is missing them because it learned them. And that distinction, that single razor-thin distinction, is going to change the way you understand yourself for the rest of your life. So let's go there. Let's go all the way in. Because the paradox at the center of this experience is this. The people who caused us the most harm are often the ones our nervous systems become most attached to, not despite the chaos, but because of it. The wound and the source of the wound become neurologically entangled. And when that person disappears, your brain doesn't register relief, it registers loss, it registers danger. That is what we're going to understand today. To understand why your brain misses someone who hurt you, we have to first understand something that nobody teaches us in school, how the brain actually forms attachment. And it starts with a molecule, dopamine. You've heard of it. Most people think of it as the pleasure chemical, but that's only half the story, and the less interesting half. Neuroscientists now understand that dopamine is less about pleasure and more about anticipation. It is the brain's prediction and reward signal. It fires not when you receive something good, but when you expect something good might be coming. And here's where it gets painfully relevant to you. In a stable, secure, healthy relationship, one where affection is consistent, where love doesn't have to be earned, where you can exhale, the dopamine system stays relatively calm. Things are predictable. The brain doesn't need to work overtime. It can rest. But in a volatile relationship, one characterized by hot and cold cycles, by cruelty followed by tenderness, by punishment followed by affection, the dopamine system goes haywire. Because unpredictability is crack cocaine for the reward circuit. The brain becomes hyperactivated. Every moment of warmth from that person becomes flooded with dopamine because it was unexpected. Every reconciliation after a fight becomes a neurological high because it came after withdrawal. This is what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, and it is, without question, one of the most psychologically binding forces in human behavior. B.F. Skinner demonstrated this with pigeons in the 1950s. When a pigeon got a food pellet every single time it pressed a lever, it pressed casually. When the pellet came randomly, sometimes after 1 press, sometimes after 20, the pigeon became obsessive. It couldn't stop pressing. The uncertainty itself became the addiction. You were that pigeon, and you had no idea. Now layer onto this the concept of trauma bonding, a term first developed through the work of psychologist Patrick Carnes and later expanded within attachment theory. Trauma bonding occurs when cycles of abuse, tension, reconciliation, and affection create a neurochemical loop so powerful that it begins to mimic the feeling of love, not because it is love, but because the brain, which evolved for survival, not happiness, cannot always tell the difference between intensity and intimacy. The limbic system, the emotional brain, doesn't have a moral compass. It doesn't evaluate whether a person deserves your attachment. It simply tracks, where did I feel the most? Where was I most alive? Where did I experience the highest highs? And it files that person under important. And then there is anxious attachment, one of the 4 primary attachment styles identified by John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth. If, in your early childhood, love was something that felt uncertain, something that had to be performed for, waited for, or rescued from someone else's mood, then your nervous system learned to experience anxiety as the normal texture of love, not as an alarm, as ambiance. So when you enter a relationship that replicates that uncertainty, when someone is warm one day and distant the next, your nervous system doesn't say danger, it says familiar, it says home. And when that person leaves, your nervous system doesn't say relief, it goes into withdrawal.
The body doesn't know the difference between grief and addiction. The aching you feel in your chest, the way your thoughts return to them compulsively, the way you replay conversations searching for something you can't name. That isn't just heartbreak in the poetic sense. That is your brain's reward circuitry in genuine physiological withdrawal from a pattern it had organized itself around. The default mode network, the part of your brain that activates during rest and self-referential thinking, becomes dominated by them. When there's nothing else to do, the DMN reaches for what it knows most intimately. And if it knows them, that is where it goes. Not because you're weak, because you're human. But here's what the neuroscience alone cannot fully tell you. Here is what lives underneath the chemistry, in the deeper, darker water. When you were in that relationship, you were not just experiencing dopamine cycles. You were losing yourself, piece by piece, in ways so gradual you didn't notice until you looked in the mirror one day and weren't entirely sure who was looking back. Because here is what toxic relationships do at their most insidious. They don't just hurt you. They recruit you into the hurt. They make you the one who works harder, who bends further, who explains yourself more carefully, who shrinks a little more every week to fit into the space that person allows you to occupy. Carl Jung wrote about the persona, the mask we construct to survive our environments. And many people in painful relationships develop a persona so elaborate, so perfectly calibrated to manage another person's volatility that they lose contact with who they were before. They become fluent in the other person's emotional language and illiterate in their own. And so when that relationship ends, there are actually 2 losses. There is the loss of the person, and there is the loss of the self you were inside that relationship, the self who knew exactly how to read the room, who had a role, who had a purpose, even if that purpose was painful. That self had a kind of terrible competence. It knew what to do. It knew the rules. And suddenly, in the absence of that person, you are left with a silence that asks, "Now who are you?"
That is not a comfortable question to sit with. The Roman philosopher Seneca wrote that it is not that I am brave enough to face death, it is that I am afraid of the life I have been living. There is something of that in missing someone who hurt you. Sometimes the ache for them is not really for them. It is for the version of yourself that existed when they were there, even if that version was suffering. Because suffering, when it is familiar enough, starts to feel like safety. Rainer Maria Rilke said that perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. The dragon is the longing. The dragon is the 2 in the morning ache. But underneath it, if you are willing to look, is something trying to become visible, something that needs the longing in order to finally be seen.
You miss them, yes. But what specifically do you miss? Is it the good days? Those windows of warmth that felt like everything was finally okay? That is the dopamine talking. That is the intermittent reinforcement, making the rare, tender moment feel more valuable than it would have in a stable relationship, precisely because it was so rare. Or do you miss the feeling of being chosen, of mattering to someone, even imperfectly, of the narrative, the love story you were writing in your head, the one where things eventually got better, where they finally understood you, where the sacrifice was worth it? That grief is legitimate. That grief is real. Because you weren't just losing a person, you were losing a future you had already lived inside your imagination. And that is its own kind of death.
So who are you now, after this, in the aftermath? Let's name what this kind of attachment history does to a person, not to pathologize, but to illuminate. Because awareness is not just intellectual, it is the first tremor of change. You might find that you struggle with stillness, that when life becomes calm and stable, you feel vaguely uneasy, like the quiet is suspicious, like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, because your nervous system was calibrated to chaos, and calm, paradoxically, can feel like a warning sign.
You might find that you confuse intensity with love, that relationships which feel easy, safe, and gentle don't register as romantic, that you're more magnetized to people who challenge you, not in the generative, growth-oriented sense, but in the anxious, destabilizing sense, because your nervous system learned that love and anxiety arrive together. You might find that you overextend in relationships, that you become fluent in everyone else's needs while staying strangely illiterate in your own, that you are the one who initiates repair after conflict, even when you weren't the one who caused it, because somewhere in your early emotional education, you learned that love is something you earn through effort, not something you receive through presence.
You might find that you carry an outsized fear of abandonment, one that makes you cling or preemptively withdraw or self-sabotage relationships before they can hurt you on their own terms. Your nervous system learned that people leave or that love is conditional, and it has been running that operating system ever since. You might find that your sense of self-worth is relational, that you feel most whole and most valuable when you are needed by someone, and most hollow and formless when you are alone. Not because you are codependent in some simplistic pop psychology sense, but because the mirror you were given to see yourself in was held by someone else, and when they left, you couldn't find the reflection anymore. And you might find that you stay long after you should leave, in relationships, in situations, in suffering, because somewhere deep in the architecture of who you are, you learned that leaving is a form of failure, that endurance is a form of love, and that the only loyalty worth naming is the kind that costs you something.
These are not character flaws. These are adaptations. These are the ways your psyche learned to navigate a world that felt uncertain, conditional, or unsafe. The problem is not that you developed these patterns. The problem is that you are still running them in contexts that no longer require them. The cage door is open, but if you've lived in a cage long enough, the open door can look like a threat. This is what psychologist Peter Levine calls the trauma response loop, the tendency of a nervous system that has experienced chronic relational stress to default to the familiar, even when the familiar is harmful, because familiarity, to the mammalian brain, is synonymous with survival, and survival at the deepest level always overrides happiness. The work, the real work, is not to shame these patterns out of yourself. It is to understand them so clearly, so compassionately, that they begin to lose their grip.
So how do you actually move through this? Not past it, not over it, through it. Because healing is not a detour around the pain. It is a slow, deliberate walk directly through the center of it, with enough light to see what's there. The first thing is to name what your nervous system is actually missing. Not the person, not in the way you think. Your nervous system is missing a neurochemical state. It is missing the predictability of the unpredictability, the high alert aliveness that characterized your time with them, the dopamine hits of their warmth, the adrenaline of their volatility, the cortisol that kept you sharp and watchful. When you understand this, you can begin to have compassion for the craving without feeding it. You don't have to act on the urge to reach out. You can recognize it for what it is, a withdrawal symptom, and let it pass through you, the way weather passes through an open field.
The second thing is to begin the work of nervous system regulation. This is not metaphorical. This is physiological. Somatic practices, breath work, cold exposure, movement, body work, even the simple act of extended exhaling begin to recalibrate the autonomic nervous system. They teach your body that it is allowed to be calm, that calm is not danger, that stillness is not abandonment. The third thing is inner child work. This sounds softer than it is. Going back, not to wallow, but to witness, the younger version of you who first learned that love was conditional, or uncertain, or had to be earned. That child made decisions about the world based on limited information. They decided that they had to be smaller, or more careful, or more useful to be loved. And those decisions became the invisible architecture of every relationship you've had since. To do this work is to become a reparenting presence for yourself, to offer the security, the consistency, the warmth that was inconsistently available then.
The fourth thing is shadow work. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is everything we've pushed into the dark, the needs we don't admit to, the anger we've suppressed, the grief we've deferred, the parts of ourselves we were taught were unlovable. In relationships with volatile people, we often project our own shadow. We see our unexpressed anger in them, our unexpressed neediness in them. The work is to retrieve those projections, to own what is ours, to integrate the parts of yourself you abandoned in order to be acceptable. And finally, perhaps most importantly, choose to practice softness as an act of courage. In a culture that valorizes strength, resilience, and toughness, the radical act is to be tender, to let yourself grieve fully without rushing toward okay, to let the longing be there without making it mean something about your worth, to let yourself be human.
Bessel van der Kolk wrote that the body keeps the score. Your pain is not in your head. It is in your tissue, your breath, your posture, your nervous system. And healing happens there too. Not just in insight, but in the body slowly learning that it is safe to return to itself. You are not broken for missing them. You are not weak for aching. You are not foolish for having loved someone who couldn't meet you where you were. You are human. Beautifully, achingly, irreducibly human. The goal is not to become someone who never gets attached to the wrong person again. The goal is not to armor yourself so thoroughly that nothing can hurt you. That is not healing. That is just a more sophisticated form of the same old cage. David Richo wrote that we cannot make someone love us. We can only become someone who can be loved, beginning with ourselves. The goal is to understand your nervous system well enough that you stop confusing intensity for intimacy, to recognize familiarity when it shows up dressed as love, to trust calm instead of fearing it, to let someone's consistency feel romantic instead of boring. If this reached something in you, if it named something you've been carrying without words, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because someone out there is lying awake right now at 2 a.m, asking what is wrong with them. And the answer is nothing. Nothing at all. The goal is not to be fixed. The goal is to become whole.